Chapter 1, Lesson 4, Wetland Environments. In this lesson, we're going to talk about what wetlands are, and also why they're important to us. So what are wetlands? A wetland is a land area that is covered with a shallow layer of water during summer all of the year. Many of you are probably familiar with an area around your house or near your home where there's a small amount of water or a shallow amount of water during at least a portion of the year. Human actions have destroyed many wetlands. Often we remove wetlands to pave the ground for parking lots, or also build industry and other types of buildings. Estuaries are wetlands found along coastal regions. In many coastal regions, we remove estuaries to produce beachfront properties. So this picture shows an estuary. Estuaries border freshwater environments and saltwater environments. That border is usually along beachfront areas where we just simply bulldoze the estuary under and produce beachfront properties. Mostly because beachfront properties drive a higher price than estuaries do. However, it can be argued that an estuary is far more important than a beachfront property. Wetlands help to control floods, and they provide habitats for many species. So they give a place for water to run off to, so then it isn't causing damage to property or homes. They form in areas where water is trapped in low areas, or where groundwater seeps to the surface. Some wetlands are seasonal, and they form when spring rains fall, but eventually they may dry up during other portions of the year. This is a perfect example of that. There's a low depression on the edge of this field. You'll notice the farmer did not farm in the low depression, probably because during the springtime when they were planting, there was too much water in that area. And over the course of the summer, this area will dry up, and that wetlander will no longer be available until the springs of the following year. The Everglades is a very important wetland. It's sometimes called the River of Grass. It's found in the very southern portion of Florida. They cover more than 10,000 square kilometers. Very important environment for the boundary between the saltwater of the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, and the fresh water that runs off of the land in Florida. We're going to talk about three types of wetlands. The three most common types of freshwater wetlands are marshes, swamps, and bogs, and it's important for us to know the difference between each one. This picture shows the difference between each one. Marshes are usually grassy areas that are covered by shallow water or streams. They have an abundance of cattails and other tall grass plants. This picture represents a marsh. The area over off of 127, the Maple River flooding area, that would also be considered a marsh. It's a very broad area with lots of grass growing, lots of cattails, and a very shallow area of water over top of the land in that area. Swamps are located in humid regions where trees can grow quickly. They're characterized by an abundance of woody plants growing from shallow water. Most swamps look like a flooded forest. The interesting thing about swamps is often in those environments, those trees or those woody plants are able to survive despite the fact that they are somewhat submerged in water almost year-round. Bogs are more common in cooler northern areas. Michigan is an example of that. They form in depressions left by pieces of melting ice sheets. The water in bog tends to be more acidic and mosses tend to thrive in those areas because mosses can grow fairly easily in acidic soils. The mosses may form thick mats that cover areas of shallow water. There is a bog just outside of Vesterberg, north and west of here. That bog is operated by Elma College and Central Michigan University. Those two colleges collaborate with one another in order to do quite a bit of biological study within that environment. This is a picture of a freshwater bog. You can see that reddish algae or reddish moss that is growing out into the edge of the water, into the shallow area of the water. You can actually walk out on a lot of that moss on a bog, and when you jump up and down on it, it kind of bounces up and down a little bit like a trampoline. It's kind of a cool experience if you ever get a chance to go and visit a bog. Coastal wetlands. Wetlands along coasts usually contain both freshwater and saltwater. Coastal wetlands include salt marshes and mangrove forests. Salt marshes are found along the east and west coasts of the United States. In salt marshes, grasses grow in the rich mud. So salt marshes are predominantly found along California, Oregon, and Washington states, along the border between the continent and the ocean. And then on the east side, it basically runs the entire eastern seaboard. Mangrove forests are found along the southeastern coast of the United States. In these forests, short mangrove trees have thick, tangled roots. So predominantly they're found along the Gulf Coast, and then a few up and around along the eastern seaboard of Florida. So why are wetlands important to us? The layer of water covering a wetland can vary from several centimeters to a few meters deep. Dead leaves and other plants and animal materials serve as natural fertilizers in that environment, so they supply nutrients to the environment as a whole. They add those nutrients to the water and to the soil, where plants can then reuse them and grow. Wetlands are important to wildlife as well. They provide habitats for many species of organisms because of their sheltered waters and rich supply of nutrients. Many organisms use wetlands year-round as their home. Some organisms use wetlands for only parts of the year, as they migrate from nesting areas to warmer climates. Wetlands' importance to people. For much of history, we've drained wetlands, and we have done so in order to develop agriculture, residents, and businesses. This picture represents the draining of a wetland area. Since the 1970s, we have enacted a number of laws that have been meant to protect wildlife and wetlands. Water moves slowly in wetlands, allowing wastes and impurities to filter out. So wetlands serve as an area to hold water, but also they serve as an area to filter out impurities that are found within the water. And those wastes can eventually be absorbed by the plants within the wetland environment. Plant roots help to trap silt and mud. That keeps those materials from washing off into nearby rivers and streams. Wetlands act as a natural water filter. They also help to control floods by absorbing extra runoff from heavy rains. Often we remove wetlands for farming area. When we do have floods, and rivers and streams do flood every year, there is some place in our country that has flooding. When we remove those wetlands, the water no longer has a place to run off to or to be stored in, and simply it runs off into the land in the surrounding area that we've turned into agricultural fields, or we've turned into suburban areas. Wetlands work like giant sponges. They store water until it gradually drains or evaporates. When wetlands are destroyed, the floodwaters are not absorbed. So those floodwaters are left to just sit on the land, over top of the area that was probably turned into agricultural land. Instead of water running off of the land, very quickly, it worsens the flooding problem. So that water, it quickly moves to rivers. It quickly moves to streams. And when it quickly moves to rivers and streams, those rivers and streams get too much water. They're filled to capacity with water. And that water doesn't have anywhere to go. So downstream areas end up with an excess amount of water, and they end up with excess flooding. Wetlands also help to moderate climates. Temperatures are cooler in summer and warmer in winter than they would be without wetlands. Mostly because water does a really good job of storing heat energy. It stores heat energy during the summer, keeping things somewhat cool, and then during the winter, it gives off that excess heat energy, causing things to warm up slightly near wetland areas.
Welcome to Wetlands 101. What is a wetland? Today we're going to look at two different types of wetlands that exist in Delaware.
Delaware is a very flat state with 90 miles of coastline. Being so flat, it doesn't drain very well, and we have a lot of different types of wetlands. One fun fact about wetlands in Delaware is that almost any location in the state is usually about a mile away from wetlands. Today we're going to show you two different types of wetlands that are common in Delaware and a few characteristics that define them. There are three important signs to look for when looking for a wetland: soils, vegetation, and water. So we're here right now in a classic tidal salt marsh. This area here is fed by the Delaware Bay. The tides come in and inundate this area twice a day and feed this area with water and nutrients and fresh sediments. So here we have taken a soil core from the tidal marsh, and you can see down in the hole that the water level is very high. That's a sign of just a high water table. And you can see from the core that's laying out on the ground that the hydric soils are ranging from gray to very dark. So due to the fact that these soils are constantly wet, there are certain chemical processes that go on in the soil, and one of those creates the distinct smell of tidal marsh. The hydrogen sulfide smells a little bit like rotten eggs. That's characteristic of a salt marsh.
We've now moved to a forested wetland here in Delaware, and this wetland type makes up about 3/4 of our wetlands. You can see we're in a low area, which we would say is a depressional or a woodland pool here, which has recently dried up. They're typically wet in winter and spring, and now it's June, so this one has really just started to dry. And some folks might not realize that this is even a wetland because there is no surface water right now, but there is some groundwater here, and to be a wetland you have to have the hydrology of water during the growing season, so it has to be enough to affect your plant community in a way that they can tolerate growing in those wet conditions. So we have some wetland species here. Behind us we have some grasses. So here we have a blueberry bush, a high bush blueberry, and a clethra, a sweet pepper bush plant that are growing on a nice hummock, and you can see that there's a moss line just at the top of just at the bottom of the plant here that's actually elevated. So when the water table is high here, the water comes up and the moss line will actually grow above the water when it's at its peak. Here we have a black gum, a mature black gum, which is found in very wet areas. So growing along the surface here we have sphagnum, which is a very a wet, conducive plant as well. Grows in very wet areas. Here in our forested wetland, the surface does appear dry, but the groundwater is about 10 centimeters or so below the surface, and it's just started to recede since we're in June now. But you can see the soil is a very, very dark color and has a very soft texture. And it has a very high degree of organic matter in it, which is typical in some of our forested wetlands. In our non-tidal wetlands, they do offer a great resource for habitat, both plant and wildlife, as well as provide a great source for rainwater and flood storage. You can see in this area that the water level is down, so if we were to get a heavy rain, it would be able to absorb that water and not flood someone's property or upland property with a home on it. Since some of our wetlands in Delaware do appear dry, it does cause some issues with folks not knowing that we have these wetlands, and can lead to some of them being developed or converted to agriculture. And since Delaware started to monitor this and keep track of the percent or the amount of wetlands that we've lost about 5,000 acres since the early 1980s.
Over the past 30 years, non-tidal forested freshwater wetlands have suffered 2/3 of the documented wetland losses. These wetland losses can be attributed to development, conversion to agriculture, or natural losses as well.